Cops arrest black female general. Then her call to the Pentagon destroys their lives. The sun was high in the sky, and the quiet suburban street looked calm as people walked their dogs. Children played with bikes, and a soft breeze moved through the trees. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever seemed to happen. At least, that was what the three officers believed as they drove slowly down the road in their patrol car, laughing at jokes only they found funny. They had worked together for a long time. The bond between them was less about honor and more about habit. When they laughed, it was often at someone else's expense. To them, the uniform they wore was not only a duty, but also a shield, a symbol that gave them power in the eyes of ordinary citizens. And that power was something they enjoyed. As their vehicle rolled to a stop near a large oak tree, one of the officers spotted a woman walking calmly on the sidewalk. She wore plain clothes, black slacks, a neat blouse, and comfortable shoes. Her hair was tied back tightly, and she carried herself with quiet dignity. She did not seem rushed. She did not seem nervous. In fact, she looked like she knew exactly where she was going. "Hey, look at her," one officer said with a smirk. The others turned their heads. The woman did not glance at them, did not slow her pace, did not even seem to notice. To them, her calmness felt like indifference, and that alone was enough to bother them. They pulled the car to the curb. Two officers stepped out, their voices filled with forced confidence. "Ma'am, hold up. We need to ask you a few questions." The woman stopped, turned, and looked at them with eyes that held no fear. Her voice was steady. "Is there a reason you are stopping me?" Her calmness unsettled them. They expected nervousness, excuses, maybe even panic. Instead, she spoke like someone who had nothing to hide, someone who understood authority far better than they did. "We'll ask the questions," one of them said, his tone sharp, trying to reassert control. "Do you have identification?" She reached into her pocket slowly and handed over her ID. One officer glanced at it, his expression flickering for a second before he forced a laugh. "Danielle Carter." "All right, Danielle, where are you headed?" "On my way to a meeting," she said. The officers exchanged looks. Something about her composure irritated them even more. Instead of answering with uncertainty or rushing to explain herself, she gave short, clear answers. Her tone was polite, but it carried weight, as if she did not need to prove herself to them. The third officer, who had stayed by the car, finally stepped forward. "Meeting, huh? With who?" Danielle paused. Her silence lasted long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then she said, "That is not information I need to share with you." It was a simple response, but it struck them as defiance. In their minds, no one spoke like that unless they were hiding something. The laughter that had filled their car minutes ago turned into smirks as they decided to escalate. "Well, ma'am, you don't get to decide that," one of them said. "We'll take you in, ask you a few more questions at the station." She looked at them quietly as if measuring their words. There was no protest, no raised voice, no attempt to argue. She simply said, "Do what you feel you must." The officers exchanged glances again, this time unsure. Her tone was not fearful, it was steady, almost commanding. But instead of backing down, they doubled down on their authority. They moved closer, one of them pulling out a pair of cuffs. "Turn around." The people across the street, neighbors watering their lawns, a teenager sitting on his bike, stopped to watch. The sight of three officers surrounding a single woman drew attention, but no one dared to interfere. Danielle turned slowly and placed her hands behind her back without hesitation. The metal cuffs clicked shut. She did not resist. She did not speak, and that silence was louder than anything else on that street. The officers laughed again, though less naturally this time. One nudged the other. "Guess she isn't so tough now, huh?" As they led her to the car, Danielle glanced at the nearest child watching from the sidewalk. Her expression softened for just a moment, almost like a silent reassurance. "Do not be afraid." Some truths reveal themselves in time. Inside the patrol car, she sat straight, her posture firm, her eyes forward. Most people slouched in those seats, defeated or nervous. Danielle looked like she was sitting in a waiting room, calm, patient, and unbothered. The ride back to the station was filled with laughter from the officers, mocking comments and casual jokes at her expense. But if they expected her to react, they were disappointed. She remained silent the entire way. At the station, the mood remained the same. The officers spoke loudly, cracking jokes, enjoying the attention of their peers. Danielle was guided into a small holding room. She sat at the metal table, her hands still cuffed, her expression unshaken. Finally, one of them asked, "You want your one phone call?" "Who you gonna call? A lawyer? Your mom?" The other two laughed loudly at the comment. Danielle lifted her eyes and met theirs. Her voice was low but firm. "Yes, I will make a call." They handed her a phone as if it were part of the game. She dialed a number slowly, deliberately. Her voice when she spoke was different now, measured, commanding, precise. "This is General Danielle Carter. I have been unlawfully detained. I require immediate confirmation of protocol." The officers froze. The laughter stopped instantly. The name, the title, it did not match the picture they had painted in their minds. But before they could respond, Danielle ended the call with 4 words that would haunt them. "They will be there shortly." The silence that followed was heavier than chains. The officers forced themselves to laugh again, though their voices shook. "General? Yeah, sure. That's what you are now, huh?" But deep inside, they felt the first sting of fear, because Danielle Carter was not like anyone they had ever stopped before. The room felt too small, the air thick with a tension the officers could not quite name. Danielle Carter sat at the cold metal table with her hands cuffed, calm and silent. The officers tried to laugh again, trying to wash away the unease her phone call had left behind, but their laughter sounded hollow now. Something in the way she had spoken, the sharp certainty in her voice, kept replaying in their heads. A woman who could sit that straight, speak that firmly, and call herself a general did not sound like someone bluffing. Still, they pushed away the thought. To them, she was just another arrest, someone they could toy with until the paperwork was done. They convinced themselves that she was lying, and yet none of them could ignore the chill her words had carried. One officer leaned against the wall, smirking as he spoke. "So, General, huh? You in charge of what? A chess club?" His voice was mocking, but he kept glancing at the door, half expecting someone to walk in already. His partners chuckled, but the unease spread like smoke in the room. Danielle did not respond to his joke. She simply looked at him with steady eyes, the kind of gaze that made people feel smaller than they wanted to admit. Her silence was not weakness. It was power, and they all felt it. Minutes dragged on. Outside the holding room, voices of other officers floated through the station. Phones rang, paperwork shuffled, the ordinary noise of a precinct on a regular day. But inside that room, everything felt slower, heavier. Danielle finally broke the silence, her voice calm and controlled. "You should not have done this." The words were simple, but they landed like a weight in the room. One officer laughed nervously. "What are you going to do, call in an airstrike?" The others joined in, but the sound of their laughter no longer carried the confidence it once did. Each chuckle sounded like a cover, a shield against something they could not explain. Danielle did not answer him. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her cuffed hands resting neatly in her lap, her posture never bending. She looked less like a prisoner and more like a judge quietly waiting for the trial to begin. One of the officers stepped outside, partly to get a drink of water and partly to shake off the strange feeling she gave them. He scrolled on his phone absent-mindedly, but then he noticed something strange. A group chat of fellow officers lit up with urgent messages. There were reports of unusual communications coming from the Pentagon, of a sudden surge in encrypted calls, of something big happening that no one understood yet. His throat went dry. He pocketed his phone quickly and told himself it had nothing to do with the woman in the holding room. It was a coincidence. It had to be. Inside, Danielle finally spoke again. "The people you have mocked today will not laugh with you tomorrow. And when they arrive, you will realize how small your world really is." Her tone was not threatening, not even angry. It was a statement, delivered as calmly as if she were discussing the weather. That calmness made the officers shift uncomfortably. They had dealt with angry people before, with shouting, threats, and desperation. But this was different. This was the voice of someone who knew exactly what was coming and saw no reason to argue about it. Time ticked on, each second slower than the last. The officers began to argue quietly among themselves. "She's bluffing," one said, though his voice shook slightly. "Pentagon, General? Come on, that's insane. She's just messing with us." "Then why do I feel like she isn't?" another replied. He glanced through the small glass window in the door, half expecting black SUVs to roll up outside any second. Their doubt grew with every passing moment. Danielle said nothing more. She closed her eyes briefly, breathing evenly, her composure unshaken. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman waiting for a meeting she already knew the outcome of. Her silence was worse than any speech. It gave their imagination space to run wild. Finally, the officer who had left the room returned, his face pale. He leaned close to his partners and whispered, "I just got word. Washington called the captain directly. They asked if a General Carter was in custody. They said it's urgent." The words hit the room like thunder. Suddenly, the laughter disappeared completely. They turned to Danielle, who opened her eyes slowly and looked at them with quiet certainty. She had not moved an inch, but now it felt as though she controlled every corner of that room. One officer tried to recover, forcing a laugh that sounded strained. "So maybe you are who you say you are. Big deal. That doesn't mean you're above the law." Danielle's gaze did not waver. "Above the law? No. But far beyond your reach." The silence that followed was suffocating. The officers no longer felt like the ones in control. Their own words seemed smaller now, powerless against the weight of hers. They looked at each other nervously, and for the first time that day, they questioned not her but themselves. Minutes later, the sound of sirens echoed faintly outside the station. Not the usual city sirens, but deeper, stronger, belonging to vehicles that did not patrol neighborhoods. Engines rumbled like a warning. Radios crackled with sudden bursts of static. Officers around the station began to whisper, their voices filled with confusion. Something was happening, something they had never seen before. In the holding room, Danielle sat perfectly still, her head tilted slightly as though she could already hear the vehicles approaching. Her expression never changed. She had expected this from the moment she made her call. The three officers looked at each other, panic flickering in their eyes. This was no bluff. They could feel it now in their bones. Something larger than them, larger than this station, was about to arrive. One officer leaned forward, his voice suddenly softer. "Who are you, really?" Danielle looked at him, and for the first time, there was a trace of sadness in her eyes. "I am someone who has spent her life protecting this country, and today, you chose to treat me as less than a citizen." Her words cut deeper than any threat. They were not meant to intimidate, but to remind. The room grew colder with the weight of truth. The rumble outside grew louder. Black SUVs rolled into the lot, their tinted windows reflecting the station's lights. Men and women in suits stepped out, their movements sharp and professional. They carried no hesitation in their posture. This was not local enforcement. This was federal. This was the Pentagon's answer. The three officers stood frozen, their earlier laughter nothing but a ghost now. Danielle remained seated, her presence calm, steady, and unshaken. The door to the holding room opened, and the atmosphere shifted entirely. The people who entered looked directly at Danielle, saluted briefly, and addressed her with words that silenced every doubt the officers had left. "General Carter, we're here." The officers' world collapsed in that moment. Everything they thought they knew, every ounce of power they believed they held, vanished. The woman they had mocked, cuffed, and laughed at was not just someone important. She was a force far beyond their understanding. And her silence had been the loudest warning of all. For the first time, the three men realized that the story of this day would not be theirs to tell. It would be remembered for something far greater, and it had only just begun. The arrival of the black SUVs outside the station was like a thunderclap in the middle of a quiet afternoon. Engines rumbled, doors opened sharply, and men and women in dark suits stepped out with the kind of presence that silenced everything around them. They did not rush, and they did not need to. Their movements were calm, precise, and purposeful, which only made the air feel heavier. The three officers who had mocked Danielle Carter minutes earlier froze where they stood, their laughter caught in their throats. For the first time, they understood what it meant when someone carried real authority. Inside the holding room, Danielle sat exactly as she had been sitting, her hands still cuffed in her lap, her posture straight. She did not look surprised. She did not even look relieved. She looked as though everything was happening exactly the way she knew it would. Her calmness unnerved the officers more than the arrival of the agents outside. She had never raised her voice, never begged, never even asked them to stop. She had simply made a call and waited. And now the results of that call were walking through the front doors of the precinct. The atmosphere in the station changed instantly. The ordinary noise of phones ringing and officers chatting died away. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as men in suits flashed credentials no one dared to question. Their expressions were cold and serious, their words clipped and professional. They asked for one thing only: General Danielle Carter. The name hit like a strike of lightning, sending ripples of shock through everyone who heard it. The captain of the station tried to step forward to ask questions, but the agent in charge looked at him with a stare that carried more weight than any explanation. The message was clear. This was no longer his ground to command. The three officers looked at each other with faces drained of color. Their smirks were gone, replaced by unease they could not disguise. One of them whispered, "She really is who she said she was." His voice shook, barely audible, but in the silence of the room it sounded louder than he intended. Another officer tried to force a laugh, the sound weak and unconvincing. Maybe it's just coincidence. Maybe there's another Danielle Carter. But even he could not finish the sentence with conviction. The agents approached the holding room. The door opened and two stepped inside. Their movements were crisp and their eyes locked on Danielle immediately. They did not look at her with suspicion, nor with amusement. They looked at her with respect. One of them spoke, his voice low but firm. "General Carter, we are here to escort you." The title hit the room like a hammer. The officers' earlier laughter echoed in their minds, mocking them now instead of her. General. She was not only someone important, she was someone they never should have touched. Danielle slowly stood, the cuffs still on her wrists. She did not glance at the officers as she rose. Instead, she turned toward the agents with the same calm she had held since the beginning. The agent nearest to her frowned at the sight of the cuffs and immediately removed them, his hands quick and deliberate, almost offended that she had been restrained in the first place. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "we apologize for the treatment you've received here." Danielle nodded once. Her eyes did not soften and she did not smile. She had no need to. The apology was not for her comfort. It was for the shame of the men who had placed her in cuffs without realizing who they were dealing with. The officers watched helplessly as their world unraveled. They had treated her like an ordinary civilian, like someone they could mock, intimidate, and dismiss. But now, with every word spoken in that room, it became clear that she was not only beyond their authority, she was a figure who could alter their futures with a single report. Fear crept into their expressions, fear that grew heavier with every second. Danielle finally looked at them, her gaze steady and unflinching. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she spoke in a tone so calm it sent chills down their spines. "Power without respect destroys the one who holds it." The words were not shouted. They were not delivered with anger. They were spoken like a truth carved in stone, impossible to deny. The officers felt them in their bones. They realized then that their laughter, their arrogance, their careless abuse of the uniform had not only disrespected her, it had humiliated themselves. As she stepped out of the holding room, escorted by the agents, the station seemed to shrink around her. Other officers stared in disbelief, whispering to each other, trying to understand how such a mistake could have happened. The three men who had arrested her remained where they stood, paralyzed by the weight of what they had done. Every laugh they had shared earlier now replayed in their heads, twisted into echoes of their downfall. The SUVs waited outside, their engines humming steadily. Danielle stepped into one without hesitation. The door closed, and just like that she was gone from the station. But the silence she left behind was louder than anything they had ever known. The captain finally turned to the three officers, his face pale with anger and fear. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he hissed. His voice was low but deadly serious. "You arrested a decorated general of the United States Army. Do you understand what kind of storm is about to fall on this department?" The words sank in like stones dropped into deep water. The officers could not reply. They could only stand there, faces pale, hearts racing, as the reality of their actions closed in around them. Their laughter had died, replaced by fear. Fear of consequences they could not yet see but knew were coming. Hours later, as reports were written and phone calls exchanged, the truth of Danielle's identity became undeniable. Files revealed her service record, her leadership in operations they could not even fully read because of clearance restrictions. Medals, commendations, missions, all confirmed that she was not only a general but one of the most respected figures in national defense. She had been entrusted with decisions that affected entire nations, and they had treated her like a criminal on the street. By the time night fell, the three officers sat in silence, their confidence shattered. They had laughed at her once, mocked her without thought, but now as the weight of her name and position pressed down on them, laughter was the last thing on their minds. All that remained was the gnawing fear that their careers, their reputations, and their very lives as they knew them were about to be destroyed by a single phone call, and the truth it carried. And deep down, each of them understood one thing they could never erase. The moment Danielle Carter had looked at them in silence was the moment they should have realized she was far more than they could comprehend. Now it was too late. The following morning, the precinct did not feel like the same building. The air was heavy, the mood subdued. Officers who normally joked over coffee now whispered in corners, their eyes darting toward the captain's office where the three men who had arrested Danielle Carter sat waiting. No one wanted to be in their shoes. The events of the day before had spread quickly, faster than gossip usually traveled. It was not every day that three officers mocked and handcuffed someone who turned out to be a decorated general of the United States Army. And it was not just any general. The name Danielle Carter was being spoken with a mix of fear and awe. Inside the captain's office, the three sat rigid in their chairs, faces pale, uniforms suddenly feeling too heavy on their shoulders. The captain stood behind his desk, his fists pressed against the wood as though the weight of the situation might break it in half. His eyes burned into them, his voice sharp when he finally spoke. "Do you realize what you've done? Do you have the faintest idea?" They did not answer. Each of them wanted to speak, to explain, but their throats felt dry. They had thought they were in control yesterday, laughing at the woman who carried herself with quiet dignity. But now, with files laid open on the desk in front of them, their arrogance had collapsed into silence. The documents on the desk revealed what none of them had believed possible. General Danielle Carter's service record read like the story of a life lived in defense of her country. Years of leadership, operations carried out under her watch. Missions so classified that even the summary lines were marked restricted access. She had medals of honor, commendations for bravery, acknowledgments from presidents and defense secretaries. She had advised leaders in crisis, commanded troops in war zones, and negotiated on behalf of the nation. The list of her achievements seemed endless, and every line cut deeper into the three men's pride. One of them finally found the courage to speak, though his voice trembled. We didn't know who she was." The captain's face hardened. "That's the problem. You didn't care who she was. You saw a woman walking alone and you thought it was funny to stop her. You thought your badge gave you the right to humiliate her. And now, because of that arrogance, you've insulted one of the most respected leaders this country has." The words were like a hammer pounding into them. Each syllable drove home the reality that their careers might already be over. While they sat there, agents from Washington arrived again, this time with an air of formality that made the entire station stiffen. They carried files, took notes, and spoke quietly with the captain. Every move they made felt like judgment, and though they did not raise their voices, everyone knew these men and women carried authority that could crush careers in an instant. News traveled faster than whispers. Within hours, the story reached the local media, though the names of the officers were not yet released. Rumors swirled online, speculating about what had happened at the precinct. Words like mistreatment and power abuse were already being used. The three men watched helplessly as the situation slipped further from their control. Meanwhile, Danielle Carter was not hiding. She was not avoiding the spotlight. She was back at her post, already in meetings, already commanding respect from those who worked under her. For her, the incident at the precinct was not an obstacle. It was an example, an illustration of what arrogance looked like when faced with true strength. That afternoon, a press release confirmed what the whispers had already guessed. General Danielle Carter had been unlawfully detained by local officers during what should have been an ordinary walk to a private meeting. The statement was brief, professional, but devastating. It praised Carter's composure, her service, and her contributions to national security. It made no mention of the officers by name, but it did not have to. The silence left space for the world to imagine, and that imagination was enough to destroy reputations. At the station, tension grew unbearable. Other officers looked at the three men differently now, not with camaraderie but with distance. They had crossed a line that everyone understood could not be undone. Their laughter from yesterday had become their undoing. Later that evening, the three of them were summoned again, this time not by their captain but by representatives from Washington. They sat in a larger room now, facing men and women in suits whose expressions never softened. A recorder clicked on the table and questions began. Every detail of the arrest was dissected. Why they stopped her, how they treated her, why they ignored her words. The more they spoke, the more it became clear that excuses would not save them. One of them broke down midway, his voice cracking. "We didn't know. She just looked like anyone else." The agent across the table leaned forward, his voice cold. "And that is exactly the problem. You thought anyone else could be treated that way." The room went silent. The weight of that truth pressed down on them harder than any punishment. Meanwhile, Danielle Carter sat in a quiet office in Washington, reviewing reports from abroad, discussing strategy with her staff. She did not need to dwell on what had happened. Her focus was always forward. But when one of her aides asked if she wanted to issue a personal statement about the arrest, she shook her head. "No. Let the truth speak for itself. Her restraint carried more weight than anger ever could." She did not need to defend herself. Her life's work, her rank, her service, all of it stood as evidence of who she was. Back at the precinct, the three men left the interrogation room with shoulders slumped. They no longer looked like enforcers of the law. They looked like men stripped of the illusion of power. Their badges still shone on their chests, but even they seemed smaller now. That night, each of them sat in their own homes, staring at their phones as news reports spread further. They replayed the moment she had said those words on the phone. "This is General Danielle Carter." They replayed the silence that had followed. They replayed the look in her eyes, calm and steady, as if she already knew what was coming. And now, with the world closing in on them, they understood that look. It was the look of someone who had seen storms before, who knew that truth always arrives, no matter how long it takes. For Danielle, the storm was already passing. For them, it was just beginning. The night air in Washington was quiet, but the weight of what had happened the day before still lingered in conversations behind closed doors. For most people, it was just another evening, but for the officers who had mocked and arrested Danielle Carter, it was the beginning of a storm they could no longer control. In the precinct, their names were whispered with pity and fear. In Washington, their actions were already written down in reports stamped with words like urgent and classified. And at the center of it all was the woman who had never raised her voice, never pleaded, never begged, General Danielle Carter. Her call had lasted less than a minute, yet its echoes were powerful enough to shake the foundation of the very precinct that thought it could silence her. That single moment, that calm voice on the phone, had not just summoned cars and agents. It had revealed the truth about authority, that true authority did not need to shout, did not need to show force. It only needed to be recognized. For Danielle, the morning began as it always did. She was at her office before sunrise, papers neatly organized on her desk, her staff already moving with precision. She did not mention the arrest. She did not complain about the humiliation of being cuffed on a sidewalk. She had endured far worse in service to her country, and she understood that some battles were fought not with weapons but with patience. She let the system work, because she knew that her silence would speak louder than any angry statement ever could. But for the precinct, silence was unbearable. The three officers sat at their desks, unable to focus, waiting for news that would decide their futures. Every phone call made them flinch. Every closed-door meeting reminded them of the mistakes that had dragged them into this nightmare. The captain no longer looked at them the same way. The camaraderie they had once enjoyed with their colleagues was gone. Their laughter had turned into isolation. By noon, the call they dreaded came, not to them directly, but to the captain. He stepped out of his office, his face pale, his jaw tight, and summoned the three into the briefing room. The blinds were drawn, the door closed, and the air was heavy. "The Pentagon has reviewed everything," he said flatly. "They're not just looking at what happened yesterday. They're looking at your entire records. Every complaint, every time someone questioned your judgment, every report you thought had been forgotten, it's all being reviewed now." The words were like a stone dropped into still water. Each officer felt the ripples spread through his chest. They had believed their past behavior would always be covered by the shield of the badge. That laughter and bravado would bury mistakes. But now nothing was buried. Everything was uncovered. One of them swallowed hard. So, what happens to us now? The captain's eyes narrowed. That isn't for me to decide. But you should prepare yourselves. Whatever happens next is out of my hands, and that was the truth. The call Danielle had made was not only about her release. It had been a trigger, a signal that carried upward into halls of power where arrogance had no shelter. Decisions were being made in rooms they would never see, by people they would never meet, and their names were at the center of those discussions. While they sat in dread, Danielle continued her work. She led meetings with young officers, advised on strategy, and reviewed reports from across the world. Yet those who worked closest to her noticed something in her demeanor, a quiet weight not of anger but of disappointment. It was not about her pride. It was about what she had witnessed. People trusted to uphold the law, using it instead as a tool for humiliation. She did not need to demand punishment. She only needed to let the truth reach the right ears. And the truth had already spread farther than the officers could have imagined. By evening, another call came. This time it was to the precinct itself. An official from Washington requested that the 3 officers be placed on immediate suspension, pending investigation. Their weapons and badges were collected. The moment the badges were lifted from their uniforms, each man felt the weight of reality crush him. The very thing they had once used as a shield, the symbol they had believed made them untouchable, was gone. They stood stripped of authority, stripped of the power they had once laughed with. When word spread through the station, no one cheered. No one gloated. Instead, the silence was heavy, filled with unspoken lessons. Everyone understood that what had happened was more than punishment for arrogance. It was a warning for them all, that power without respect collapses on itself. At home that night, the 3 men sat separately, each lost in thoughts that refused to let them sleep. They replayed the arrest in their minds. The moment they had laughed when she asked why she was being stopped, the smirk when they had clicked the cuffs on her wrists, the mocking tone when they handed her the phone. Every detail returned like a ghost they could not shake off. And then they remembered the calm in her voice, the way she had said those words. "This is General Danielle Carter. I have been unlawfully detained." They realized now that her voice had been the sound of truth, and truth had no fear. Meanwhile, in a quiet office in Washington, Danielle sat with her staff. One of them asked her directly, "General, do you want these officers prosecuted? Do you want to push for charges?" She looked at the young aide, her expression thoughtful. After a long pause, she answered softly, "Justice is not about revenge. It's about lessons. If they learn, the system becomes stronger. If they don't, the system will deal with them. Either way, I do not need to destroy them. They have already destroyed themselves." Her words carried wisdom, and her staff fell silent. It was not anger that guided her. It was principle. She understood that the real punishment was not in what she could demand, but in what they had already lost. Their dignity, their respect, their future in the uniform they had misused. In the days that followed, news of the suspension spread beyond the precinct. Media outlets began to cover the story more openly, though carefully, always highlighting Danielle's achievements and her calm in the face of humiliation. She became a symbol not of anger but of strength. People admired the way she had handled the situation. Young recruits looked at her as proof that dignity was more powerful than aggression. For the 3 men, each headline felt like another nail in the coffin of their careers. They could no longer walk through their own neighborhoods without feeling eyes on them, whispers behind them. Families they once knew now looked at them with quiet disappointment. Children who once waved at them from porches now turned away. They had not only lost their authority, they had lost their place in the very community they thought they controlled. And all of it had come from one simple phone call. The irony was not lost on them. They had mocked her for asking to make a call, certain it meant nothing. They had laughed when she dialed the number, certain no one important would answer. They had dismissed her words as arrogance, certain their authority was greater. But that one call had unraveled everything they believed about power. That call had shown them that true power did not shout or mock, it simply acted, and the world listened. As the days turned into weeks, the officers waited for the final decision. They lived in constant fear, each sunrise bringing with it the possibility of a letter ending their careers forever. And though they tried to blame circumstances to excuse themselves, Deep down they knew the truth. They had mocked the wrong woman. They had disrespected the wrong citizen. And in doing so they had exposed themselves to the world. For Danielle Carter, life continued. She carried on with her duty, not letting the incident define her. Yet for those three men it would define everything. That phone call, calm and precise, had been the moment their laughter ended. And the silence that followed would echo in their lives for years to come. The suspension of the three officers was only the beginning. For days the precinct buzzed with whispers, not of laughter or pride, but of fear and shame. Their colleagues avoided eye contact, their names carried in hushed tones as though even speaking them too loudly would invite trouble. Everyone had seen the truth unfold. Authority abused in the wrong hands could crumble faster than anyone expected. And now, the three men who once strutted through the halls with smirks and arrogance walked like shadows of themselves, stripped of their power and weighed down by the heavy silence of judgment. Outside the precinct, the world had not forgotten either. News channels continued their coverage, careful in their language but sharp in their implication. Reports highlighted Danielle Carter's dignity, her service, her remarkable career that stretched across decades. They spoke of her leadership in foreign missions, of the way she commanded respect in the highest offices of government, of the countless soldiers who had followed her into danger without hesitation, because they trusted her judgment more than their own instincts. And then they compared that woman to the treatment she received on a quiet street from three men who thought power meant mockery. For the officers, every broadcast felt like salt rubbed into their wounds. Their families watched too, unable to ignore the storm. Children asked questions at school. Neighbors looked differently at them on the street. What had once been laughter and pride now tasted like ash. They felt smaller every day, their arrogance turned to dust by the weight of truth. Meanwhile, Danielle Carter carried on as though nothing had happened. She walked into meetings with her head high, led discussions with clarity, and continued the endless work of protecting a country that sometimes failed to protect her. She never once spoke publicly about the arrest, never once demanded punishment. Her silence was not weakness, it was wisdom. She understood that true justice did not need her anger to fuel it. The truth was enough, and the truth was already destroying the lives of the men who had mocked her. But justice did not stop at suspension. The Pentagon's review dug deeper, pulling out files, revisiting complaints, and speaking to people the officers had once thought powerless. Old stories surfaced, small incidents that had been buried, complaints dismissed, moments when arrogance had outweighed respect. Alone, those moments seemed forgettable. Together, they painted a pattern, and that pattern was undeniable. Within weeks, the final decision came. The three men were terminated from their positions, their badges revoked permanently. No quiet transfer, no second chance, just the end of a career they thought would shield them forever. The letters arrived on a cold morning, simple envelopes carrying the weight of their downfall. As each man opened his letter, the silence in his home was deafening. Families read the words with wide eyes, unable to believe how quickly everything had crumbled. The badge that once brought pride now brought only shame. Humility came late to them, but it came nonetheless. Without uniforms, without the authority they once abused, they were forced to face the truth. They were no longer officers of the law. They were simply men, ordinary and forgotten. The power they once flaunted had been nothing more than borrowed authority, and now that authority was gone forever. Time passed, and the storm that had once surrounded the precinct slowly began to fade from the headlines. The news cycle moved on to other stories, other controversies, and other faces. But for those who had lived through it, the memory never disappeared. The three former officers carried it with them like a scar, a mark that no amount of silence or denial could erase. And for General Danielle Carter, the incident became less about her humiliation and more about the lesson it left behind. She did not speak of it often, not because she wanted to forget, but because she understood that repeating the details did not matter. What mattered was what people remembered. And what they remembered was not the handcuffs on her wrists, not the jokes made at her expense, but the quiet dignity with which she handled it all. That was the lesson that remained, long after the laughter of the officers had died. The recruits who trained under her guidance never forgot either. Danielle had always been a demanding leader, expecting precision, discipline, and honesty from those she mentored. But after that incident, her presence carried an even deeper weight. When she walked into a room, silence followed, not out of fear but out of respect. Everyone knew the story, even if it was told in whispers. They knew that she had faced disrespect not with anger but with strength, and that her composure had turned a moment of humiliation into a lifetime of inspiration. One afternoon, during a leadership seminar at the academy, Danielle stood before a room filled with young cadets. They were eager, nervous, and ready to prove themselves. She looked at them for a long moment before speaking, her voice steady and clear. Many of you believe power comes from the uniform you wear. You believe authority is something given to you when you put on a badge or a rank. But the truth is, power comes from something deeper. Power comes from integrity. Without it, a uniform is nothing more than cloth. With it, even without a uniform, people will recognize your authority. The room was silent. The cadets hung on every word. Danielle continued, her eyes steady. I learned that lesson long before I became a general, and I was reminded of it not long ago, when people who wore uniforms chose to forget what theirs meant. They believed their badges gave them the right to mock, to humiliate, to diminish others. But in doing so, they destroyed themselves. Authority is not about control. It is about responsibility. Abuse it, and it will collapse under its own weight. Her words sank into the young men and women before her. Many of them scribbled notes, but more than that, they felt the weight of what she was saying. It was not a lecture from a textbook. It was truth, born of experience, spoken by someone who had lived it. After the seminar, one cadet approached her. He was young, nervous, his voice uncertain. General, how did you stay calm when they disrespected you? How did you not shout or fight back? Danielle looked at him kindly, her expression softening. Because shouting would have given them power. My silence reminded them that they had none. Sometimes the strongest voice is the one that refuses to rise. The cadet nodded slowly, his eyes wide with understanding. That answer stayed with him, and later, when he wore his own uniform, he repeated it to others. The lesson spread quietly, carried not by newspapers or broadcasts, but by the voices of those who admired her. Meanwhile, the 3 former officers struggled to rebuild their lives. Without their badges, they were ordinary men, forced to confront the reality that their laughter had cost them everything. Some tried to find new jobs, but doors closed when their pasts were revealed. Others sank into bitterness, blaming circumstances instead of their choices. But deep down, all 3 knew the truth. They had mocked a woman who had given her life to protecting the very country they claimed to serve. And they had lost because of it. On quiet nights, they remembered her face, the calm way she looked at them, the steady voice on the phone, the certainty in her words. It haunted them, not because she had threatened them, but because she had not needed to. Her dignity had been enough to unravel their arrogance, and now, without their uniforms, they understood what they had never seen before. Respect was not something you demanded. It was something you earned. For Danielle, life moved forward. She continued to serve, to lead, to inspire. The incident became a story others told, but she never allowed it to define her. She was not the woman who had been arrested. She was the general who had stood tall when others tried to diminish her. And that difference mattered. Years later, when she retired from active service, the story was still remembered. Younger generations who had never met her spoke of her composure, her strength, and her lesson. Her name carried with it a quiet authority, not because of the rank she held, but because of the respect she had earned. At her retirement ceremony, surrounded by fellow soldiers, officers, and leaders, one speaker summarized it perfectly. General Danielle Carter taught us that integrity is the highest form of power. She reminded us that strength is not always loud and justice is not always quick, but both arrive when we remain true to what is right. The audience rose in applause, not out of formality but out of genuine admiration. Danielle stood tall, her uniform gleaming, her face calm as ever. She did not smile widely or bask in the attention. She simply nodded, the same quiet dignity she had carried all her life shining through in that moment. For those who listened, for those who remembered, and for those who carried her lesson into their own service, the story of that day on the sidewalk was not about 3 officers and their laughter. It was about one woman's strength, her calm, and her refusal to be diminished. It was about the truth that respect is more powerful than arrogance, and that dignity once held can never be taken away. And so, long after the incident was forgotten by headlines, the lesson remained. In classrooms, in training halls, in whispered conversations between young recruits, the name Danielle Carter stood as a reminder. A reminder that power is not in the uniform, but in the person who wears it. A reminder that silence can be stronger than shouting. A reminder that respect once earned lasts far longer than fear. The officers had destroyed themselves with laughter. She had strengthened herself with silence. That was the difference. That was the lesson. And it remained long after.